Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, steps, slaves, hearse, peasants, vassals. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And so I think this is probably a good time for Zelensky to finally sit down and negotiate for peace for two reasons. One, there's a gigantic corruption scandal going on in the Ukraine, and it's barely scratched the surface of the corruption there. But also, and the point of my video is that Ukraine has clearly lost the war, as I did videos before talking about the fact that in reality, after a hack into the Ukraine minister's office, we found out that over 1,700,000 Ukrainians have been casualties, and then we have an astronomical rate of desertions, upwards of 250,000. And in fact, right now we're reaching probably the bloodiest point in the war. Well, amongst the Ukrainians, we have 1,335 casualties a day. 456,695 have been killed, missing, or wounded as of just November 2025. And Ukraine is losing 40,000 a month as casualties and 20 to 40,000 desertions each month. And so there's no way that even with all their efforts, Ukraine can sustain. And one good evidence of this is they haven't launched a counteroffensive since 2023, and even that one ultimately failed. But they can't even muster any kind of counterattacks. And obviously the flow of weapons is slowed down too. But four major cities have been encircled and captured. Four more cities are surrounded. We're having thousands surrender in the past 2 months, and Russia is moving in further and further across the entire 1,000-mile front. And so half the power in Ukraine's been knocked out. Millions more refugees have fled to Europe just in the last several months, and the Ukraine war doesn't have popular support anymore. I think upwards of 67% of Ukrainians want this to end. And one of the things that's interesting too is this talk that the Russians have borne a lot of casualties, and certainly they have, but they've mobilized 1.5 million troops for this operation, so they far outnumber Ukraine. And then as far as casualties, they're 36 to 1. Ukraine is losing 36 to every Russian killed. So a lot of the figures about Russian losses, they are high, but they're certainly been exaggerated for political purposes. And one of the other things I found interesting in the research is that even aside from Ukrainian forces, there's actually 100,000 mercenaries in Ukraine. There's NATO personnel, there's CIA people, and interestingly enough, they've recruited lots of mercenaries from Colombia and Latin America, to the point where there's actual complete battalions of just people from Colombia. So that's amazing that they've been able to bolster their military force using 100,000 mercenaries. But those mercenaries in the end won't be very dependable. And I'm sure a lot of them are bailing right now, seeing the writing on the wall that Ukraine has lost this war. They're never going to take Crimea back. They're never going to take the Donbass back. They can barely keep Russia from moving forward at all points on the front. And in fact, the Ukrainians are spread so thin, not only are they getting slaughtered, but there's huge gaps in their lines that are only monitored by drones, because they've just run out of people to field, and they've done everything they can. Of course, the snatch and grab programs all over Ukraine to just forcibly conscript people, throw them into the front lines. The fact that the average age of the soldiers on the Ukrainian front is somewhere between 40 and 60, and that even prisoners and criminals and people from mental asylums, people with disabilities, even pregnant women have been shown mustered into the front where they know it's a death sentence. And one of the other interesting things about this is that ultimately, now that we have this peace offer, this is going to be a point where Zelensky really needs to take a serious look about accepting these terms, no matter how much they go against what he wanted to gain for Ukraine in any peace arrangement, because he has no he is in no position to negotiate really now. Ukraine is lost. If he doesn't settle now, there's going to be a lot more Ukrainian losses. There's going to be a lot more destruction in Ukraine, and he will. There's just no chance, in spite of all the cheerleading, for Ukraine to win this war or even have it arrive at a stalemate. Russia is just too unrelenting and too powerful, and they've completely decimated Ukraine's forces and the infrastructure in Ukraine. So it's all over. So I would imagine, along with a bunch of other factors, this is a good time for Zelensky to take a good hard look about the fact that he's going to have to give up Donbass. And in fact, it's really kind of disingenuous that Ukraine talks about hanging on to the Donbass, because that's a region of Ukraine that Ukraine has been bombing since 2014, and they've done everything to oppress the Russians in that area. They don't want Russian-speaking people there. They'd like to get them out, but they forbid the teaching of Russian in schools, and they've shut down the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and they've done nothing to oppress that region. So it's really kind of bizarre, other than the pride and losing a fifth of their country, that they fought so much to hold on to those areas of Ukraine. But of course, we know that the West has been instrumental in turning down all the peace arrangements that have been done before. In fact, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a peace agreement fielded, and Europe and the United States basically forced Zelensky to turn it down and to continue this war for a couple more years. And that's what Europe wants, is for this war to go on, and this whole theory of attrition with Russia and hurting Russia. But that hasn't succeeded either. So it's lost, and it's been evident for quite some time. In fact, there was very little hope from the beginning that Ukraine could ever lose this war, but the writing is totally on the wall now. They have lost. Ukraine has lost this war. I'm a useful idiot, don't you be one too?